after the Dark Ages, right? A time of collapse, of decay. But what if that wasn't the end of the story? What if it was actually the beginning? For 1,000 years, a whole new civilization was forged in Europe, one that laid the very foundations of our modern world. It's an incredible story of collapse, reinvention, and rebirth, and it all started with an ending. So, to really get this new beginning, you have to understand the dramatic end that came right before it. The Roman Empire, the famous Pax Romana, was a world of stability. It was all interconnected by roads, ruled from one single center. But after it fell in the West, that world didn't just fade away, it shattered. And in its place, fragmentation, chaos, and a world that shrunk down to small, localized pockets of power. It was a total rewiring of how society worked. So, how in the world do we get from that shattered reality to the one we know today? Well, we're going to trace that incredible story in 5 parts. We'll start with the chaotic dawn after Rome, then look at a grand experiment to bring it all back together, a period of amazing growth, a devastating crisis that broke everything, and finally a rebirth that set the stage for the modern world we live in. All right, let's dive in. Our story kicks off right after 476 CE. The last Western Roman emperor is gone. And in that power vacuum, a new, uniquely European civilization starts to crawl its way out from the rubble. You can kind of think of this new world as being cooked up from 3 main ingredients. First, you've got the lingering ghost of Rome, its laws, its languages, and just the powerful memory of a single unified empire. Then you have the Christian church, which gave a common spiritual identity to all these different peoples. And finally, you have the so-called barbarian peoples, the Germanic tribes who brought their warrior cultures and set up the new kingdoms that would eventually become Europe. So with no central government, how did society organize itself? I mean, what held it all together? The answer was a system we now call feudalism. And this wasn't just some political reshuffling. It was a huge psychological shift. Your loyalty wasn't to some abstract thing like Rome anymore. It was to a person, a local lord who could actually protect you in a very dangerous world. It was a practical solution built on promises, not laws. The basic deal was pretty simple. A powerful lord would grant a chunk of land, called a fief, to a lesser noble who was called a vassal. In return, that vassal swore a personal oath of loyalty and promised to show up and fight for his lord when he was needed. Land for loyalty, protection for military service. This whole web of personal bonds was literally the glue holding early medieval society together. So, for centuries, Europe was just this fractured patchwork of personal loyalties. But then, one man came along who had a much bigger dream. He wanted to rekindle the flame of the Roman Empire. And that man was the great Frankish king, Charlemagne. And this was a moment packed with unbelievable symbolic power. I want you to picture it. Christmas Day, the year 800. The Pope puts a crown on Charlemagne's head and declares him emperor. For the first time in over 300 years, the West had an emperor again. It was a message to the entire world that a new, legitimate power had arrived, a true successor to Rome. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This dream of a unified empire didn't last. Charlemagne was a one-of-a-kind ruler, but the system to hold such a huge territory together just wasn't there. After he died, his grandsons fought over it all, and in 843 they split the empire into 3 pieces. And what's so crucial here is that in that division, you can see the very first rough outlines of what would become modern France and Germany. After Charlemagne's grand experiment fell apart, an age of terror began. With no central authority, Europe got hammered from all sides. You had Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, and pirates from the south. This constant threat meant people couldn't wait for some distant king to save them. They looked to the local lord and his new stone castle. Power became even more local, even more personal. But after weathering all those storms, Europe didn't just survive, it actually began to thrive. Right around the year 1000, the invasion stopped, the climate got a little warmer, and a period of incredible growth and confidence kicked off. And this wasn't just a small uptick, it was a revolution. And it all started in the fields. Better farming techniques, new technologies, they created a surplus of food. And more food means, well, it means more people. This population boom fueled the growth of towns and cities. It revived long-distance trade, and it created a whole new dynamic merchant class. Europe was waking up. And all of this new energy, it couldn't be contained. Europeans started pushing their borders out in every single direction. In Spain, Christian kingdoms began the Reconquista against Muslim rulers. Norman knights went and conquered England and southern Italy. And in the East, Christian armies marched all the way to the Holy Land in the Crusades. This newfound confidence created a massive new political question that would define the entire era. In a Christian world, who's the final boss? Is it the emperor, the guy with the armies, or is it the pope, the guy who holds the keys to heaven? The answer to that question came in a crazy, dramatic showdown between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, when the pope excommunicated the emperor, basically kicked him out of the church, over who had the right to appoint bishops. The most powerful man in Europe was forced to stand like a beggar, barefoot in the snow, for 3 days, just pleading for forgiveness. It was a stunning, unforgettable display of the power the papacy now had. So, after 300 years of growth and prosperity, the medieval world seemed to be on top of everything. But then, in the 14th century, it didn't just stumble. It fell off a cliff. A series of unimaginable catastrophes would completely shatter this world. The greatest of these catastrophes was, of course, the Black Death. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. In just a few short years, the plague wiped out at least 1/3 of the entire population of Europe. It was a demographic disaster on a scale that we have never seen before or since. But, Anne, this is wild. Out of that unimaginable horror came a profound and totally unexpected social revolution. With so many people gone, the survivors found themselves in a brand new world. All of a sudden, labor was scarce, and it was valuable. Peasants, who for centuries had been tied to the land, could now demand higher wages, more freedom. The old feudal bonds were broken, forever. And that brings us to our final chapter. The crises of the 14th century weren't an ending. They were a violent catalyst. From the ashes, a new, more modern Europe began to rise. A trio of innovations really drove this transformation. Gunpowder and cannons meant a king's army could now just blast down the castle of any rebellious noble, which centralized power like never before. The printing press allowed ideas to spread faster and further than anyone could have dreamed. And all this led to the rise of the sovereign state, with powerful kings and queens ruling over more unified countries. The second half of the 15th century saw this rapid-fire succession of transformative events. In 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks completely shifted global trade routes. Just a few years later, Gutenberg's printing press starts to change communication forever. And then, in 1492, the very same year Spain finally completes its centuries-long Reconquista, Columbus reaches the Americas, pointing the way to a new, global future. So by the year 1500, Europe had really come full circle. From the broken pieces of Rome, it had forged a new civilization, survived a crisis that was almost apocalyptic, and came out the other side stronger, more dynamic, and ready to export its power, its technology, and its ideas all across the oceans. This whole 1,000-year journey just goes to show how crises and new ideas can forge an entire civilization. And it kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it? What are the huge shifts and foundational changes happening in our own time that people will be looking back on 1,000 years from now?